So we also have conditionals, which are going to be changing the flow of our programs depending on what we want to happen. And then we have functions. And functions are sort of the verbs of programming is how I see it, right? It's those actions that can happen whenever we call them, and we first define them, just like we would define any verb in the dictionary, right? We write out their definition, and then they only get executed once we actually. And so we also have these functions, which we can call throughout our program whenever we need to. Now, from now on, please, if you have any questions, please shoot in the chat, and I will make sure to read them out loud. Let me make sure I have the chat available. Just 1 second. Where is my? Oh, here. Cool. Awesome. So yes, please shoot out any questions if you have them throughout the course, and I'll make sure to answer any questions you might have. So let's begin. So whenever we're thinking of animations, we're really going to be just interacting with the DOM. But what is this DOM that's, seems so tenebrous, although it's cute looking now there with my pastel colors. DOM actually means document object model. And the document object model is no more than the graphical representation that your browser is printing out from the response that it's getting from the server. So, whenever we're writing code and we'll get to a site. So let's try, for example, let's try the Admios site. And at this moment, whenever I'm writing that URL when I'm writing that link up in the URL space, I'm basically requesting to get that site, and then I'm going to be getting it back in an HTML, CSS, and JavaScript format. What the browser is doing with that, it's going to be interpreting it, showing me this graphical interface, and creating the DOM. So whatever you see in here, this is actually the DOM. Now, what is the difference between the code that I wrote in my code editor and the DOM HTML code that I see here? Does anyone know? So I'll give you a bit of a hint. And the difference is how our browser is interpreting that information. So before, what we were writing is going to be stored in a server somewhere in probably North Virginia. And what we have in the DOM is actually what my browser has right now in my current computer. So that's why if, for example, I grab this tiny little text in there and I change clients to Juliette, this will actually get changed. But this is not changing in the source code in North Virginia. This is only changing in my computer. So that's that big difference there between the code that I'm getting from my code editor and what I'm interacting with the DOM. So what we're going to be doing with JavaScript is that we're going to be tapping into that DOM that our browser is producing, and we're going to be implementing some animations that will only be occurring in the user's computer. So we're going to write it, store it in the source code, but only until our user starts actually interacting with our site, that's when our animations will actually get executed. So let's see what that actually means. Now, when we think about the DOM, we can see it as a tree just like upside down, right? So you see that we first have our HTML document, which is that big sort of bigger HTML element that we have. And then HTML will have two things, a head and a body. And then the body will have several elements. We'll have an h1, a div, an ordered list, etc., etc. And what we're going to be playing is with these elements so that I know that whenever I'm grabbing the UL, inside of the UL, I will also have several LIs. Each LI will have a p tag, etc., etc. So let's have some fun. Now, let's say I will go onto my Google site, right? Everyone has been here probably way more times than we can count, but I bet you guys have never played with it in the DOM. So let's select, for example, this LGA element. Now, if we see here, this has an ID called LGA, And if you remember from our HTML course, these IDs are just the way in which we can identify and select those elements in. So now that I have the ID of LGA, let's go into my console and let's actually grab it. So the first thing I will do, and this is the first thing that we'll do every time we want to animate, is actually select the elements that we want to be applying our animation to. So I'm going to create a constant variable called, let's just call it LGA. And here, I mean, who knows what LGA stands for in Google? That doesn't really matter for us. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, document. And document here is this document that we're getting. So the document from the DOM. And I'm going to say to that document, please select me my LGA element. But look how I called it. So I passed a hash in front of it because it's an ID. So I'm using my CSS selector to select this particular element. So that when I call on LGA again, what I see is that I'm actually having exactly that element that I selected before. Is that clear to everyone? Or is there any questions up until now? Okay, cool. So once we have that element, now we can start playing with it. So if I open up this little arrow in here, I can see all of the different crazy stuff I can pass to that element. So I can see that I can retrieve the site where that element is living in. I can retrieve the inner HTML that it has inside of it. I can retrieve the child's elements that are inside of it. I could retrieve a whole bunch of stuff. But a very cool one is the style one, because the style basically means that I'm calling on my CSS style for that given element. So I can say LGA, grab me the style, and maybe change the background color. I'll change the background color to a hideous red. And if I print that, immediately we can see that on my DOM, this color for that element is turning red. And if I refresh, immediately that's gone, right? So that's the big difference between us interacting with our source code and then us interacting with the DOM. Now, any questions up until here before I carry on to the more funky stuff? Okay, oh, is that the element ID? Yes, that is the element ID. And bear in mind that we can pass it any type of CSS selector. So we'll see that in a second. Now, whenever we're thinking of animations, we're usually gonna be following 4 simple steps, okay? So number 1, we're gonna select the element that we wanna be animating. Number 2, we're gonna hire an event listener, and we'll see what that is in a second. Then we'll give that event listener a mission, and then we'll create the animation for that element. So what does this really mean? It means that I'm selecting the element. I'm gonna hire a bit of a watchman, so someone that's gonna be constantly looking out for that element. Then I'm gonna say what behavior is gonna be triggering that animation inside of that element, and then I'm gonna make the animation. So let's see how that looks like. First, we select a paragraph, right? And like I said before, we're playing with CSS selectors. So in this case, I'm just targeting the paragraph element. So what I always try to do is that whenever I select something, I try to just console log it so that I can make sure that what I'm actually grabbing is actually what I'm expecting. Unfortunately, you'll see that more often than not, we're grabbing the wrong thing. So just keep that in mind. But like I said before, you can select it just by passing the CSS selector of the element, or we can select it by its class, just like we would grab the element from CSS, or we could select it by its ID, just like we would select an element by its ID on CSS, right? So whenever you're thinking of how to select the elements, just think of how you would be selecting it if you were to apply some style to it. Now, once we have our element, that's when things get interesting. So the first thing we want to do is that we want to hire our event listener. And our event listener, you can think of it as like a little elf on the corner of your site, just looking over that paragraph constantly, right? It's like you're hiring a personal bodyguard for that paragraph. And that event listener just going to be looking out. It's looking out, but what is it looking for? Depends on the mission that you pass it, right? So that event listener is just going to be looking out for whenever the user clicks on that paragraph. Now, this click could be a mouse over. This could be whenever you press a key up or a key down. It could be whenever you drag the paragraph. So you can apply lots of different styles or lots of different missions, sorry, to that event listener. But let's play with click for now because it's something that we all know and use every day, right? So what we're telling it here is saying, hey, please watch over our paragraph so that when a user clicks on it, this animation gets executed. And what's this animation? Well, that's going to be something like what we just did before, where we're going to be passing some interaction, some style change, some inserting or removing elements to our specific elements that we've chosen. So this is how it would look like. We have the paragraph we've selected, we have the event listener, and we know that when it clicks, I want this to happen. Now, what is this animation? This animation is a function I've created that basically takes an event. What's this event? This event is the event of clicking, and we'll see how that looks like in a second. But it's gonna take that event and we're gonna store it so that we can use it to find the specific element that we wanna animate. Now, keep in mind that we could have a behavior where we click on a paragraph and then an image gets bigger or smaller. Or we click on a paragraph and then our background changes crazy. So not necessarily the event, the element that you're applying your event listener to is going to be the same element that's going to take the animation. So keep that in mind, because in that sense, we're selecting two elements. The first one is the one for the event listener, the one the event listener is going to be looking out for. And then the second one is the one that the animation is going to happen to. So in this case, our element is in fact paragraph, because we're selecting the event from the clicking event, and we're getting the event target, which is paragraph, and we're going to change the color, we're going to change the font weight, we're going to change the font size, and we're going to do some sort of crazy stuff to it. So let's see how that would look like in our code. So let's check out the program that we've been running before, which is, yeah. So this is our profile page that we were creating for the course for the past few weeks, which basically says that I love to code, travel, and write, and has tons of crazy GIFs on it. And let's apply what we've just learned. So I go into my console, and I'm going to say, I'm going to create a variable called paragraph, which is going to say, hey, document, please select me my P tag. Now, when I do that, and I write paragraph on my console, I'm immediately going to get the first paragraph element that's on my site. So keep that in mind. When you're running query selector is really grabbing the first element that matches your selector that you passed it here. Cool. So up until that point, we have our paragraph. Now, once I have that paragraph, I could just change the style for it to be a color blue, and that'll change. I could also grab my paragraph and change maybe the font weight of that paragraph and have that be bold. But I could have tons of other options. So I have the text content here, for example. I could say paragraph, let's go into text content and have that be hello world. Now when I print that out, we see that the text in here actually changes. So now let's do that with our event listeners, right? So I have my paragraph, and I'm gonna add my event listener, my watchman, and I'm gonna have its behavior change for when I click. Now, what's gonna happen is that we're gonna grab in the event, and the first thing that I wanna show you is what that event actually looks like. So you see that when I hit when I hit enter, still nothing has happened. So this only gets triggered the moment I actually click on my paragraph. So that's the first thing, right? Whenever we're clicking on paragraph, that's when my event listener says, hey, implement this. Let's console log the event. And in this case, the event is a click event that has as a target my paragraph element. So that means that if I say, please console log me my event target, what I'm gonna get now is my paragraph tag. Cool. So now let's do a reload so we can have it from scratch. Let's create our paragraph element again. Oops, typo. So yes, so now we have our paragraph element. And now let's actually apply some fun animations to it. So I'll say to my paragraph, please add me an event listener. And let's check all of the different DOM events that we have. So a very good documentation is actually the one from Mozilla. I think I've recommended it before in the course. But this is very nice because it shows you exactly all of the different events that we could have for any given element. And I'll share this on the chat so you could see it. I see we have a question here that says, but this only changed on the client side, right? How do we change it on server side? Okay, great question. So indeed, this is only changing on the client side, but we'll be writing it on the server side. And I'll show you how to do this by the end of today's course. So we can see here that we have all of the different events that can be triggered. So for example, focus and blur. This is something that's very common on input fields of forms. Whenever we click on an input field, that's when we're focusing. Whenever we release, that's when we blur. And we can have it so that when we click there, something gets triggered, some animation happens. We can also have it from when a CSS animation starts. Then we want to have some JavaScript animation occur. Maybe when we hit submit on a form, then we want something else to happen. When we do command print and you see that print dialog pop up, maybe that's when something will get triggered. So when we copy, when we paste, when we press a key down or a key up, when we move the mouse over, mouse up, when we select, when we drag. So these are all different types of events that we can give to our event listener so they can look out for, and we can trigger some animation to it. So let's do maybe a mouse over to change things up a bit, spice it up. And we're gonna grab the event, which I've established before is this event listener we've just hired. And we're gonna select the element and we're gonna say that the element is the target of that specific event. And to that element, we're gonna pass it maybe let's change the text. So we'll say that the text will be hello friends, and then we're gonna pass it some styling differences. So we're gonna do a cool color, maybe like pink, and then we're gonna pass it some other stuff like some font size. Now look at this interesting thing. So even though font size would be a number, and usually in CSS we'll just write it straight out, because now we're in JavaScript, this we have to pass as a string. So that way JavaScript can actually read it, understand it, and pass it as CSS to our element. So keep that in mind. I know this is a lot of information, but just keep it in mind so that when you're writing out your JavaScript, you're always thinking of how your JavaScript is going to be interpreting that information. And then when I press enter, nothing has happened yet, right? Because I am all over my website. I'm not there yet. But when I go over it, boom, that's when my things change. Now, we can do this with anything in our site, right? I could have it so that maybe whenever my mouse passes over my event list, my paragraph, maybe that's when my image changes. So I can have an image variable, which will be document query selector image. And then to that image, maybe we can pass a weight, a different weight. So that could be, let's say 300 pixels, so that it's pretty obvious. So we enter that, and then when we go through it, what's happening? Some image should go out. So you see, this is why we always try to console log. Let's make sure I'm actually grabbing something. Yes, I'm grabbing my avatar, and why is it not changing? So let's try to do height here, unless I have a typo. No. Oh, there we go. So my height changed and it just became thinner. So this is a perfect example where I am passing the mouse over to this paragraph, but what I'm actually animating is some other element somewhere else in my page. Okay, cool. So now let's see, and let's answer Alexandra's question, and let's see how we can add that into the server. Now, before we do that, I'm going to change the chat to see if we have any questions. So Jose asked one, that is it possible to perform an image change with a different image by just hovering on the original one? Yes, exactly. So as long as you have two different elements, the one that you're applying the watchman to and the one that you're animating. And you can always change between the two in whatever you want to be implementing. So you could have it so that when your mouse goes over one image, maybe another one changes, or maybe you even replace the image of that given image that you're in. And it's all about what you're looking to do, that you can use those event listeners to work for you. I don't know if that answered your question, Jose, but if you want to follow up, oh, cool. Awesome. And then Vane, yes, everyone is muted, but trolls, man, who knows? So now let's answer Alexandra's question, and let's see how we can actually add that onto our source code. So let's go to the file that we've created. I called it developer. You can have called it anything else. And I'm going to drag it onto my text editor. So the first thing that I'm going to do, and we can see here that we have our HTML file with all of the information in that file that I was showing you. We have our style to it. And now we're going to have a third file, which is going to be called index.js. Oh, wait one second. Yes, index.js. And now I have a third file. Now, here's where I'm going to be writing that code that I was just showing you. So I can say const paragraph equals document query select me my p tag, and let's just have a console log to see that we're actually grabbing something. And if I save that and I go onto my page and I reload, nothing is showing up. Now, remember what happened with CSS? We had a similar thing, right? Even if we had those two files within that same folder, nothing will get executed because we have yet to link them together. So if we want to link them together, that's where we're going to grab in our HTML and actually pass something that will link the two. So rather than doing it in the head, as we were doing it with CSS, in this case, we want to do it at the bottom of our file. And the reason why we want to do it at the bottom of our file is because usually JavaScript is heavy, right? Whenever we're using JavaScript, it means that our browser is going to be having to work a lot more because the information is not just coming from the server, but it actually has to implement some stuff in your phone or in your computer. So we want to make sure, for a better user experience, that the user is downloading the entire HTML and CSS file, and then only when that's done, that's when the JavaScript will pop in. So that while that's working, at least the user is seeing something, and it's not just thinking that your computer is so slow or your website is poop or whatever. So the way we add JavaScript's file onto our HTML is through a tag called script. So realistically, and we can try it out, but realistically, whatever we pass inside of our script tag will get run as JavaScript. So if inside here I pass a console log saying, hey people, and maybe pass it an emoji, yes. yes, because everyone loves emojis. And when I reload, I get my JavaScript code. But it can get very dirty and messy if we're just adding all of that stuff into that same file. So what we want to do instead is that we want to pass it a source, just like we pass the same thing with our image. And the source will be the path where our JavaScript file is. So we'll pass it index.js. And by doing that, when we reload now, we'll see that actually paragraph element that we just queried in our source code. So that means that now inside of my JavaScript file, I could write those animations we were discussing before. So I can say, hey, paragraph, get me an event listener when I click that shall go in, that shall get me first the element. So I can do something like element target, and then we'll just pass in some random stuff like element, maybe inner text, and let's say something like happy Wednesday. And when we do that, we reload, nothing is happening yet. Oh, add event listen, typo, add event listener, we reload, and then at that point, nothing is occurring until I actually go into my P tag, I click it, and then that's when my animation will get triggered. So that is how we can create animations in our source code that will get executed inside our DOM. Any questions on that? Let me just get the chat. Any questions? Any questions? That was a lot of information. Was it all clear? Yes. Cool. So I'll give you a bit of a sneak peek onto something else, because we said before that whenever we're selecting an element, when we run a query selector, we're only going to be selecting that first element that we find, right? Which is why sometimes if I want to grab, for example, medium, I go into my inspector, I select this specific A tag, which is inside of a div called social media, inside a unordered list, inside a list item, inside an A tag, right? That's when I gotta go in here and I gotta say, let's get the medium. Oh, not a capital letter. Let's get the medium link. So we're gonna say document query selector, and I wanna go first into, I wanna go first into my social media. So I write dot social media, right? Because it's a class. And then I wanna go inside of it. So just like we would with any CSS, I'll go inside the UL, then I'll go inside the LI, inside the A. But if I do that, let's actually make this a leg because we're gonna have to change it later. But if I do that and I type in medium, what we see is Twitter. So it's a problem, right? Because we don't want Twitter, we want medium. And medium doesn't have a class name that we can reach to or that we can find easily. So a nice hack that is pretty useful is that you do control click and then you do copy. And when you do copy, you'll get the actual CSS selector for that specific element. So that when you go into your query selector, what you can do is just paste, and you'll get exactly the CSS selector that your browser uses to select that element. So that's, oh, oops, it's because I passed and let again. So that when I select it, I am absolutely sure that I'm gonna be getting medium. So that's a nice hack in there. And of course, the more you use it, the more you'll get used to this like nth child, and you'll see different ways of selecting the same thing. So it's a matter of just playing with it and reading it and see how you can tap to specifically the element that you want. But I just wanted to show you that you could select deeper and deeper and deeper within what you want. Now, another hack is that sometimes you might want to run some animation for each of these elements. So maybe you don't just want to run it to Twitter, but you want to run it to Twitter, to Medium, to Instagram, to Facebook. And so whenever that happens, that means that we're not going to be using query selector, but we're going to be using query selector all. So let's see some social media links, and that has a terrible typo. So we have some social media links, which will be document, query selector all, and then I'm going to be grabbing inside of my social media class all of my LIs. So I can do social media LI. And when I run that and check out what social media is, I get a node list, which is not more than a list of all my 4 elements. So if I want to perform some animation to each of them, what I can do is that I can perform a loop. So I'll say, social media, please go through each of them. What are they? They are a link. Each of them is 1 link. And what I'll run, and let's first just console log it so that we can see what's happening in there. You see, we get all of them. Whenever we just go, it's just going right now through our social media list, and it's logging me each of the items that live inside of this node list. Boom. Now we can do something more fun than that. I can say to that link, add me an event listener. That's going to be a mouse over, and I'm going to pass it, and then we get funkier. So we're going to say I have my elements. It's going to be that specific link that I'm animating, and to that element, maybe just let's change the color, so that when I run that, nothing is happening yet. But when I move my mouse over it, this will be pink, this will be pink, this will be pink, and then this will be pink. So keep in mind this difference where, like, sometimes we want to be tapping onto one specific element, other times we want to be tapping into a list of elements, and it will all depend on what you're querying when you're talking to your document. Any questions there? Where's my chats? So is it better practice selecting by ID? Isaac asks. If you have the ID, yes, definitely. But sometimes you don't have the ID. So you only have IDs when it's something very specific that won't get changed. And so you don't always have ID, and that's why sometimes we'll use classes and other type of selectors just for elements. But if you have it, then it's definitely a good way to go. And actually that taps in really well with Victor's question, which is when to use query selector and not just get element by ID. And the thing here is performance. So get element by ID is only going to be looking out through those elements that have an ID and selected. Whereas query selector is going to be looking through all of the elements and then select the one with that given ID. So if you have an ID, it's better to just use get element by ID because it'll run faster. Hopefully that answers your question. And then Vanessa says, I didn't know you were able to copy the selector in the ways. Thanks for the tip. Oh yeah, man. When I learned that, my life was changed completely. So I'm happy to share the good hacks for my people. So having that said, now it's time so that you animate your page. We've been working towards this series on building your own profile, building your own sites. We're definitely looking forward to seeing what you guys have built. Make sure to add some funky stuff happening to it. Unfortunately, this is our last episode of the series, but if you've been building some cool stuff, we would love to see it. Definitely just keep in touch. This is my account, this is Admios account. Hopefully you can tell us what you've learned, maybe give us some feedback. We can see if we can run this later again, but keep in touch. It's always nice to meet people who are coding and, you know, we're interested in growing the community. So hit us up if you have any comments, messages, if you just want to chat, any questions before we go. And otherwise, we'll just keep on going. Oh, there's one. Cool. Isaac says, so, and for just do it once to return the original value, like the color, for example. Oh, so if you're asking if you just want to get back the color for that specific element, if I understood you correctly. Reply, yes, yes, cool. So it's actually the same thing. So if we run this, for example, we can say that rather than change it, maybe we could just console log it. Wait. So I can say just console log element style.color. And if I do that and I go through here, you see what I get is actually the color of that element. I don't know what's happening. But yeah, so it's the same thing. We could either change it or we could just grab that information and use it maybe for something else. That's a very good question. Cool. Well, yep, if you have any more questions, I wrote a bit of a tutorial on everything that we've been working up until now and what we saw today. So if you want to check it out, maybe there's some stuff that you missed throughout the talk or just want to practice it out, definitely check that page out. You will also be able to find all of the recordings that we've done for the series in Admios page. And like I said, feel free to reach out and we'll see where it goes. So I hope you guys have a great Wednesday and I'll see you in cyberspace. Bye.